There is a specific kind of cold that hits you when you realize you have nothing left to give. It's not a physical temperature, but a hollow, sinking sensation in your chest that tells you the math just doesn't add up anymore. You look at the bank account, or the empty refrigerator, or the unfinished project that has drained the last year of your life, and the most logical, rational voice in your head says, "Stop." We are biologically wired to avoid pain, so when the pain of trying exceeds the pleasure of the result, our brain begs us to quit. It feels like mercy. It feels like the right decision. But that feeling is a lie. That specific moment, where the friction becomes unbearable, is not the end of the road. It is actually the entry fee for a completely different way of living. In the West, we often talk about grit or hustle, but those words have become cheap. They imply that if you just scream loud enough or drink enough coffee, you'll win. There is a much older, much deeper concept that emerged from the ashes of a destroyed civilization, one that understands that true strength isn't about noise, it's about endurance. It's called Gambaru. And before you dismiss this as just another foreign keyword to put on a motivational poster, you need to understand that this philosophy didn't start in a boardroom. It started in the mud. To understand it, we have to look at 1947. Imagine the smell of smoke that hasn't cleared for 2 years. Japan had been leveled. We aren't talking about a recession. We are talking about the total erasure of infrastructure. In a small village, far from the aid trucks in the city, lived a 19-year-old boy named Kenji. He was technically the head of his household, a title that felt like a curse. His father was gone, lost to the war. Living in a small, drafty shack were his mother, his grandmother, and 2 younger brothers who were always, quietly, hungry. Kenji wasn't a hero. He was terrified. Every morning he woke up before the sun, his stomach tight with anxiety, knowing that he had to find food in an economy where money was practically worthless. He was disciplined, yes. He worked the fields, he carried debris, he did whatever menial labor he could find. But the math wasn't working. No matter how hard he sweated, the rice jar was never full. This is where most people get the concept of resilience wrong. We think resilience is a steady line going up. But for Kenji, resilience felt like drowning. One particularly freezing morning, he walked 3 miles to a local farm where he had heard there might be work. He stood at the gate, shivering, hat in hand. The owner didn't even open the gate. He just looked at Kenji through the slats and said, "Go home, kid. I can't even feed my own family." That was the breaking point. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a quiet collapse. Kenji walked the 3 miles back, his legs heavy, and when he got to the front of his shack, he couldn't go in. He couldn't face his mother's hopeful look. He collapsed on the dirt outside the door, staring up at a gray, indifferent sky. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because he was done. He whispered to the dirt, "I can't do this. It's impossible." And this is where the risk quietly increases for all of us. When we hit this wall, we assume the wall is reality. We assume our tank is empty. But the tank is rarely empty. We just lost the will to access the reserve fuel. While Kenji sat there, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see an older man, skin like leather, wearing worn-out work clothes covered in sawdust. It was a man named Tayada. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer a handout. He asked a question that cut right through the self-pity. "Are you tired, boy, or are you defeated?" Kenji wiped his face, embarrassed. "I'm looking for work," he stammered, "but there is none." Tayada looked him over. He saw the thin frame, the trembling hands, but he also saw that Kenji had walked miles just to be
rejected, and he hadn't gone home to sleep. He was sitting outside, agonizing over it. That meant he still cared. "I run a carpentry shop," Tayada said. "I can't pay you money yet, but I can give you rice, and I can teach you a trade, if you show up tomorrow." Kenji didn't feel a surge of joy. He felt exhausted. Carpentry? He didn't know a hammer from a chisel, but the survival instinct kicked in. "I'll be there," he said. The next morning, the real education began. And this is the part most people miss about the story. We assume the mentor character comes in and makes life easier. Tayada made Kenji's life significantly harder. The shop was cold. The tools were old iron that rusted if you didn't oil them constantly. For the first week, Kenji didn't build anything. He hauled lumber. He swept sawdust. He sharpened blades until his fingers bled and his back seized up. Every night, Kenji wanted to quit. The physical pain was worse than the hunger. He thought, "I am suffering for nothing. I'm not learning. I'm just a servant." One evening, as they sat drinking thin tea, Kenji finally snapped. He put his cup down hard. "Sir," he said, "I'm trying, but I don't see the point. I'm just hurting myself. I'm not getting anywhere." Tayada looked at him, calm as a stone. "You think the pain is a signal to stop," he said. "That is why you are still a boy." He leaned forward. "Have you ever heard the word Gambaru?" Kenji nodded. Everyone knew the word. It was something people shouted at sports games. It means good luck or do your best, right? "No," Tayada said. "That is the surface meaning. The real meaning is much harder. Gambaru means to stand firm. It means to endure the unbearable with patience and dignity. It doesn't mean you bang your head against a wall until you die. It means you accept that the wall is there, and you decide to work until you find a way through it, over it, or around it. You don't stop because it hurts. You stop when the work is done." Tayada filled up.
His own hands, they were twisted, scarred, missing the tip of one finger. "I lost everything in the war, Kenji. My house burned, my family scattered. I had two choices. I could lie down and die, or I could pick up a piece of wood and sand it until it was smooth. One plank, then another, then a chair, then a table. I didn't build this shop because I had hope. I built it because I had Gambaru. Hope is a feeling. Gambaru is a duty." This distinction is critical. We often wait for motivation to strike before we act. We wait to feel like it. Tayada was teaching Kenji that action must come before the feeling. You don't act because you feel good. You act to create the possibility of feeling good later. The weeks turned into months. The dynamic shifted. Kenji stopped complaining about the blisters. His hands grew calloused, turning into rough pads that could handle the wood without bleeding. But more importantly, his mind grew calloused. He stopped looking at the clock. He stopped calculating how tired he was. He began to focus entirely on the wood. He learned that if you force a saw, it binds and breaks. You have to find the rhythm. You have to persist, but you have to persist with intelligence. But life rarely lets you coast once you've learned a lesson. Just as Kenji was finding his footing, just as there was a little more food on the table for his brothers, the real test arrived. Tayada didn't show up to the shop one morning. Kenji went to his small house behind the workshop and found the old man shaking with fever. It was a severe infection. The doctor said he needed weeks of rest, maybe months. "The shop is yours," Tayada wheezed, lying under a heavy quilt. "Don't let the fire go out." Kenji was paralyzed. He wasn't an apprentice. He wasn't a master. And just that week, they had accepted a commission from a wealthy merchant in the neighboring town, a complex, intricate dining table that would pay enough to feed Kenji's family for 6 months. It was the biggest job they
had ever taken. Kenji looked at the sick old man, then at his own rough hands. The voice in his head, that logical, protective voice, screamed, "Cancel the order! You can't do this! You'll ruin the wood, you'll ruin Tayada's reputation, and you'll starve." It would have been the responsible thing to do. It would have been safe. Instead, Kenji went back to the shop, lit the lantern, and looked at the raw lumber stacked against the wall. He was terrified, but he remembered the definition: to endure the unbearable with patience. He picked up the saw. What happened over the next 3 weeks wasn't a montage of success. It was a nightmare. Kenji made mistakes.
He cut a leg too short and had to scrap a valuable piece of timber, costing him days of labor. He stayed up for 48 hours straight, sanding the surface until his vision blurred and he fell asleep on the floor, waking up with sawdust in his mouth. There was a specific night, 3 days before the deadline, where the joinery just wouldn't fit. The wood had warped slightly in the humidity. Kenji tried to force it, and the wood cracked, a hairline fracture down the center of the main panel. He stared at the crack. It looked like a canyon. It was over. There was no more wood. There was no time to start again. The fatigue crashed down on him like a physical blow. He slid down the workbench and buried his head in his arms. This was the moment. This was the moment the logic wins. You tried. You failed. It's time to quit. But then, he realized something that changes the way we look at failure entirely. He realized that the crack wasn't just a mistake. It was the material talking to him. He hadn't listened to the wood. He had tried to dominate it. He stood up. He didn't throw the table away. He looked at the crack and asked, "How do I make this part of the design?" This is where Gambaru shifts from simple endurance to adaptation. Stubbornness says, "I will do the same thing harder." Gambaru says, "I will stay in this
problem until I understand it." Kenji took a chisel and carefully, agonizingly, widened the crack. He turned it into a feature. He found a contrasting piece of darker wood, a hard ebony, and carved a butterfly key, a small bow-tie-shaped joint used to hold split wood together. He hammered the key into the crack. It didn't just hold the table together, it made the table beautiful. It told a story of something broken that had been made stronger. When the merchant arrived to pick up the table, Kenji was shaking. He had barely slept. He was covered in dust. The merchant ran his hand over the surface, his finger stopping on the dark butterfly key in the center of the pale wood. "This?" The merchant paused. Kenji braced himself for the yelling. He braced himself to beg for forgiveness. "This is remarkable," the merchant said softly. "Most carpenters would have hidden this or thrown the wood away. You highlighted it. It shows character." Kenji took the payment with both hands, bowing so low his head almost touched his knees. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt relief so profound it made him dizzy. When he went back to Tiyata's bedside to show him the money, the old man didn't look at the cash. He looked at Kenji's face. He saw the dark circles under the eyes, the new scars on the hands, and the strange calmness that settles on a man who has looked disaster in the face and survived. "You didn't just build a table," Tiyata whispered. "You built yourself." The lesson here is dangerous if you misunderstand it. We think the goal of not giving up is to get the money, or the table, or the success. But the external reward is just a side effect. The real product of Gambaru is the internal shift. Kenji could have won the lottery the next day, and it wouldn't have given him what that 3 weeks of suffering gave him. He now knew, with absolute certainty, that he could face a hopeless situation and craft a solution out of it. That is an asset that cannot be taxed, stolen,
destroyed. But how do we apply this? Because let's be honest, we aren't all starving in post-war Japan. We are fighting modern battles: depression, debt, burnout, loneliness. The principles, however, are biologically identical. Science tells us that when we are in the middle of a struggle, our brain releases cortisol. It stresses us out to make us move away from the source of pain. This is a survival mechanism. But the growth mindset, a term popularized by modern psychology, is essentially the neurological explanation of Gambaru. Researchers have found that when you force yourself to stay in the friction, when you engage with the difficulty rather than fleeing from it, your brain physically rewires itself. You are just learning a skill. You are increasing your threshold for stress. This brings us to the most critical misunderstanding about giving up. We think we give up because we run out of ability, but the data suggests we give up because we run out of perspective. We lose the ability to see past the immediate discomfort. Consider your own life right now. Think of that one area where you feel stuck. Maybe it's a business that hasn't made a profit in 2 years. Maybe it's a relationship that feels like a constant uphill battle. Maybe it's a creative pursuit where you feel like you're shouting into the void. The micro hook here is that your brain is lying to you about the timeline. We live in a world of instant feedback. We post, we get likes. We order, it arrives. We have lost the ability to endure the long, silent gap between effort and reward. Gambaru is the discipline of the gap. It is the ability to work in the dark. Kenji didn't know the merchant would like the table. He didn't know if Teyata would survive. He worked without a guarantee. That is the hardest thing for a human being to do, to work without a promise of a payoff. But this is where the magic happens. When you detach from the result and commit to the process, the fear evaporates. If you are only
working for the applause, you will quit the moment the audience gets quiet. If you are working because your standard of personal dignity demands that you finish what you started, you become unstoppable. There is a dark side to this, of course. Blind persistence can destroy you. If you are digging a hole in the wrong place, digging harder doesn't help. Gambaru requires awareness. Remember how Kenji didn't just force the wood? He adapted to it. He changed his strategy. Persistence without adaptation is just suicide. True Gambaru is flexible. It is water, not stone. It flows around the obstacle. It wears it down, but it never stops moving. As we move toward the deeper application of this, I want you to look at the contradiction in your own behavior. How many times have you stopped just because it became uncomfortable? And how many times have you looked back at those moments with regret, realizing you were inches from the breakthrough? The tragedy of modern life is not that we fail. It is that we quit before we have even truly begun to fail. We quit at the first sign of resistance. We treat resistance as a stop sign, when in reality, resistance is just the sensation of the heavy lifting required to build muscle. Kenji's story didn't end with the table. That was just the beginning of his life, but the transformation was permanent. He ceased to be a victim of his circumstances. He stopped looking at the rubble of his country and despairing, and started looking for the wood he could salvage. So, how do you trigger this switch? How do you move from "I have to quit" to "I must endure"? It starts with a simple, almost trivial mental shift that most people ignore because it sounds too easy, but it is the foundation of everything. It starts by shrinking your horizon. When we want to quit, it is usually because we are looking at the summit of the mountain and realizing just how far away it is. The sheer distance crushes us. The mental shift Kenji made, and the shift you must
make, is to stop looking at the summit. You have to look at your feet. You have to become obsessed with the next 15 minutes, not the next 15 years. Kenji didn't finish the table by thinking about the finished product every second. That would have been overwhelming. He finished it by thinking about the next stroke of the sandpaper. He reduced the world to a single piece of wood. When you shrink your focus to the immediate action, the anxiety of the future cannot survive. The brain stops calculating the odds of success and starts focusing on the mechanics of the task. But here is where the advice sounds right, but can still be dangerous if you aren't careful. We live in a culture that tells us we should only pursue things we are passionate about. We are told that if we find our passion, we will never work a day in our life. That is a lovely sentiment, but it is biologically false. Kenji was not passionate about sanding wood in a freezing workshop. He was passionate about survival. He was passionate about dignity. The love for the craft didn't come first. It came after the struggle. This is the trap. If you wait until you love the process to start Gambaru, you will wait forever. The passion is found at the bottom of the effort, not the top. You have to be willing to be bored, tired, and frustrated, and do the work anyway, because you trust that the feeling of fulfillment is waiting on the other side of the boredom. And this leads us to the most uncomfortable truth about giving up. Every time you quit because it gets hard, not because it's the wrong path, but simply because it's difficult, you are training your brain. You are building a neural pathway that says, when stress increases, I escape. The more you use that pathway, the stronger it gets. Eventually, quitting becomes your default reflex.
You become an expert at starting and a master of nothing. On the other hand, every time you push through that friction, even if the result isn't perfect, you are rewriting your own programming. You are teaching your nervous system that stress is not a signal to run, it is a signal to focus. This is why Toyota told Kenji that he built himself, not the table. The table was temporary. The neural architecture of persistence Kenji built in his own mind was permanent. So, what does this look like for you, practically, when you wake up tomorrow and want to go back to sleep? It means you stop negotiating with yourself. When the alarm goes off, or when the difficult email needs to be written, you don't ask yourself, do I feel like doing this? You remove the option of choice. You treat the task like a physical necessity, like breathing. You just do the first step. If you are writing a book and you want to quit, you don't write a chapter, you write one sentence. If you are building a business and the numbers are red, you don't try to fix the whole fiscal year today. You make one sales call. You sand one plank. You honor the philosophy of Gambaru by respecting the smallness of the effort. And remember the butterfly key. Remember the crack in the table. In your life, you are going to break. You are going to have moments where your plans split down the middle. A relationship will end. A business will fail. A health crisis will knock you down. The impulse will be to hide the crack, to feel ashamed, to throw the whole project away. Gambaru asks you to do the opposite. It asks you to look at the fracture and ask, how can I make this the strongest part of me? Maybe your failure in business teaches you the risk management skills that make your next venture unbreakable. Maybe the pain of a breakup forces you to develop a self-reliance you never had before. You take the disaster and you inlay it with something stronger. You don't hide the scar, you feature it. The people who are most inspiring to us are not the ones who never failed. They are the ones who failed, broke, repaired themselves, and kept going. Their cracks are visible, and that is what makes them beautiful. Kenji went on to run that workshop for 40 years. He never became a celebrity. He never moved to Tokyo to build skyscrapers. He stayed in his village. But over those 40 years, he took in dozens of apprentices, boys who were lost, angry, or hungry, just like he had been. He didn't just teach them how to cut wood. He taught them that they had control over their own will. He taught them that they could endure. He created a lineage of strength that rippled out through his community. That is the ultimate payoff of not giving up. It's not just about you. When you stand up under the weight of life, you give everyone around you permission to stand up too. You become a pillar. And in a world that is constantly shaking, we need pillars. You might be in the middle of your dark night right now. You might feel like the cold is seeping into your bones and the door is locked. But I want to remind you of one final thing. The moment you want to quit is usually the moment right before something shifts. The pressure is highest right before the breakthrough, because that is when the resistance is testing your resolve. It is checking to see if you really want it, or if you just kind of want it. Don't let the fatigue fool you. You have a reserve tank you haven't touched yet. Take a breath. Look away from the mountain. Look at your hands. Look at the one small thing you can do right now. And do it. Then do it again. That is Gambaru. That is how you rebuild a country, a life, or a soul, from the ashes, one piece at a time. If this philosophy resonates with you, if you feel that spark of defiance waking up in your chest, I have a small request. It's not for the algorithm, it's for you. Go to the comments and simply write Gambaru. It's a way of planting a flag. It's a way of telling yourself and the world that you are still in the fight. And if you want to understand more about the psychology of resilience and how to build a mind that doesn't break, make sure you are subscribed. We are building a community here of people who refuse to stay down. Thank you for giving me your time and your attention. Now, go find your plank of wood and get to work. I'll see you in the next video.